Hello, my name is Zil Goldstein, and I'm the US PATH Board of Directors member with the privilege of introducing Chase Strangio, a tireless advocate for transgender rights across the country as they've been under attack both in the courts and legislature. Strangio is an American lawyer and transgender rights activist. He is Deputy Director for Trans Justice with the American Civil Liberties Union since 2013. He has been counsel in many high-profile LGBTQ cases over the past decade. He served as lead counsel for the ACLU team representing Chelsea Manning and her challenge to the government's denial of healthcare while she was incarcerated. He was also part of the Supreme Court team in Obergefell versus Hodges, the case that struck down bans on marriage for same-sex couples. In the case of trans student Gavin Grimm, who was denied access to the boys' restroom at his school. In October 2019, Strangio was one of the lawyers representing Amy Steffens, a trans woman who was fired from her job at a funeral home in the US Supreme Court case RG and GR Harris Funeral Homes Incorporated versus Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This case resulted in the court's decision in Bostock versus Clayton County. He testifies regularly in opposition to bills that would restrict transgender rights and continues to litigate cases around the country to defend the rights of transgender and gender non-binary people. Without further ado, I'll give the microphone over to Chase, who will be presenting on criminalizing trans bodies in medicine, a look at the pivotal next year in trans advocacy.
Hello, my name is Chase Strangio. I am the Deputy Director for Transgender Justice at the ACLU's LGBTQ and HIV project. I am based in New York City, and I'm just really happy to be here, to be a part of this space. I have collaborated with US PATH and WPATH for the last decade in the work that I do. I primarily work on trans justice issues in courts and state legislatures around the country, and am currently deep in this moment of pushing back on all of the ways in which the self-determination for trans people is under attack at the systemic level, and at the individual level. And so I think this is such a critical moment for those of us in the legal advocacy space and clinicians in the medical and mental health spaces to really be in close contact and connect with each other. So I'm really honored to be here and really testing my limits of self-recorded presentation. So bear with me and hoping for the best. I know that in my understanding of medical presentations in the scientific field is that there's lots of use of slide decks. I am not going to do that, so it's not my skill set. But I hope that that this is still useful just to hear me speak about some of the things that are going on, and ways that I hope that we can collaborate and I can be an important resource for you as individuals and US PATH as an institution in this really critical moment that I think is going to dictate the trajectory of trans healthcare, trans survival, the conditions of trans survival over the next decade. So in the course of the presentation today, what I really want to focus on is sort of first, where are we in terms of what are the nature of attacks on trans people by the government? Where is it happening? How did we get here? And then talk a little bit about what we're doing and where we're fighting back, how that is going, and then in that conversation, talk about the role, or what I see as the role of the relationships and the partnerships between individual providers, medical institutions, both in the United States and around the world, in fighting back against what we're seeing. And then finally talk a little bit about, well, where are we going and what do we need? because I really can't stress enough that we are in the most critical moment, as far as I see it, of trans advocacy of certainly the last decade, maybe ever. And it is really an inflection point. Are we on the verge of moving towards increased gains in law and policy and public discourse, or are we about to be set on a trajectory of defensiveness and loss? And us, those of us who are in this space as individuals and those of us that are part of institutions are going to be instrumental in determining the course of the next 10 years and beyond. So thank you for being in this conversation with me. Look forward to engaging in questions. Yeah, so where are we? It's 2021. It has been a very hard year for a number of reasons. Obviously, we are now moving into, the second full year of a pandemic. And there are many, many constraints on our ability to engage with each other, to care for each other. I'm sure you've all experienced that in deeply acute ways. And as an advocate, as an organizer, I'm experiencing that as well. And this is also, I've been practicing, or, I've been advocating in the trans space for the last almost 20 years, and I've never seen anything like the scale of the attacks that we're witnessing right now. And so how I think we got here is obviously a complex question that has many different components, and we could stretch back in history a century. I think maybe perhaps what's most useful is to look at sort of the last 5 to 6 years and sort of how did we get to where we are today. And I think that what we're seeing is very much a byproduct of the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell, which was the Supreme Court case that struck down bans on marriage equality for same-sex couples. That happened in 2015. It was, a huge transformation in both the context of pro-LGBTQ advocacy as well as anti-LGBTQ advocacy. And so in the wake of that decision, you had all of the mechanisms, incredibly well-funded right-wing mechanisms that had spent years and decades trying to stop advancements for, in particular, gay and lesbian people and same-sex couples. They essentially lost at the highest court, but they still had a lot of resources, a lot of momentum, and a huge commitment to using the infrastructure of law, policy, and public discourse to entrench notions of the family and of gender in law in a way that maintained the status quo wherein the white, Christian, nuclear, heterosexual family was dominant, in which cisgender white heterosexual men had power. And so the loss of marriage equality from the antis resulted in, from their side, a very agile shift to attacking trans people. And we saw this immediately. Obergefell comes down June of 2015. By November of 2015, our opponents are well organized. They have a whole anti-trans discourse that they are deploying effectively in a fight in Houston to repeal a non-discrimination ordinance from at the ballot. And our side is completely underprepared. We have not similarly invested in a pro-trans discourse. We have not centered trans people in our movement. We have not invested in ensuring that the gains for gay and lesbian people, cisgender gay and lesbian people, forget that, we have not prioritized bisexual people. We've not prioritized trans people. We have not even prioritized a lot of cisgender gay and lesbian people. But to the extent that has been the centerpiece of the work up until 2015 within the mainstream, at least legal LGBT movement, we're not prepared to contend with what comes after marriage. And immediately we see an incredibly successful campaign in Houston that leverages fear of trans people and our bodies to take away protections for many people. They are successful at the ballot in 2015 in November. The Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, HERO, you may have heard it by that name, is repealed. And again, this is an ordinance that would have protected 15 classes of people. It was not just about gender identity protections. It was not just about trans people, but their messaging was entirely focused on trans people. particularly trans women, going to the bathroom. And the sort of specter of the quote unquote man in the woman's bathroom becomes the centerpiece of the anti-LGBTQ discourse leading into the 2016 legislative sessions. And that is when we see the proliferation of the anti-trans bathroom bills, the passage of HB2 in North Carolina, and the rise of this discourse about the trans person and the trans body as being a site of fear and threat. And that is what has really dominated a lot of the policy and legal advocacy, as well as the public conversation over the last 5 years. And it has ebbed and flowed in different ways. And I will say, to our credit, and in large part because of our partnerships with individual providers and experts and medical associations and organizations, including USPath and WPath, we were very successful in stopping, or temporarily at least stopping, the movement to ban trans people from restrooms and locker rooms, and particularly in schools. So after 2016, we effectively stopped all of those bills in state legislatures. We are incredibly successful in court. We have wins at every level. Ultimately, it looks like this question is going to go up to the Supreme Court in 2017 because of the election of President Trump. What ends up happening procedurally is the case that was set to be argued at the Supreme Court in 2017 which is Gavin Grimm's case involving a trans boy who's banned from the bathroom at his school because he's trans. That gets sent back down. So we avoid the Supreme Court in 2017. We end up having very successful litigation in the lower courts and really stem the tide of this movement for a very short, unfortunately, period of time. In the process of doing that advocacy, though, I think one of the things that we didn't really contend with was how to talk about trans people's bodies, because a lot of the advocacy around restrooms was focused on saying things like, well, you won't see a naked person in the restroom. There's so much privacy in the restroom. We don't have to contend with the realities of our sexed bodies. And we have other arguments to deploy in fighting back against this type of attack on trans people. And we were successful. And so, arguably it was an important and effective and good strategy. I think the problem is that the writing was on the wall that we were not going to stay in the restroom space. And our opponents were quickly pivoting to the context of sports, which is where we are now, and healthcare for trans minors. And so what we see, particularly between 2018 and 2020, is a refocusing from our opponents on weaponizing, once again, fear of trans people, particularly trans women and girls, in the context of sports, in order to tell a story of transness that is grounded in the fear of the trans body. And this sense that is also part of a larger misogynistic discourse and a white supremacist discourse about, the so-called fundamental differences between boys and girls, between men and women, that demands of our government some amount of policing of those categories. And what I mean by that is, this sports conversation becomes a site of ceding to the government the idea that we have to maintain these categories of male, female at any cost and open the door to scrutiny into people's bodies, both their expressive components of their bodies and their physiological characteristics. And so that's how we end up beginning really in 2019 to see this discourse around, stopping protections for LGBT people in order to enhance the power of the state to regulate the category of woman. And just one example of that is when Congress went, because the House flips in 2018 and you have a Democratic majority in the House, which means that for the first time you have hearings on the Equality Act in 2019 where there is the chance that the Equality Act, which is a proposed federal law that would explicitly expand protections under federal non-discrimination statutes based on sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as expand protections for many categories of people, including adding sex protections in Title II of the Civil Rights Act, which deals with the public accommodations. Now, in 2019, this law actually has some chance of moving in the House, not the Senate, but in the House. And so there are hearings. There are hearings on the bill, and the entirety of the first hearing held in the House in 2019 is from the opponents of the law, from the Republicans in the committee. Their witnesses are exclusively focused on the so-called threat of trans women and girls in sports. And I think this is one of these pivotal moments in which we see how the conversation and the policy advocacy that we're going to be up against has shifted, and we are unprepared. And so we got through those hearings. It was very clear that there was a growing movement of individuals who wanted to use fear of trans people to undermine LGBTQ equality generally. And unfortunately, there are lots of people who are willing to get on board with that story in order to put forth their views that trans women are not women, and that trans women and girls are fundamentally a threat to cis women and girls, and leverage a misunderstanding of trans people's experiences in our bodies in order not only to stop protections for trans people, but to undermine the entire project of LGBTQ equality in the law. And in many ways, they have started to be successful. So in 2019, you have those hearings, and I think it really sets up what we end up seeing in 2020. And in 2020, in state legislatures are convening in around January across the country. And this is when we see the inundation of these bills that focus on two things: banning trans girls from sports, and trans boys as well, at the K through 12 level, and in some states through the collegiate level. And then the emergence of this new proposed ban on healthcare for trans minors. And in 2020, we start to see these bills filed across the country. They start to have hearings, and then the COVID pandemic hits. And so what happens in 2020 is we are largely successful at stopping these bills, but that's mostly a product of the fact that lots of legislatures adjourned early because the pandemic had changed the conditions of everything, and states essentially adjourned, managed only budget. And so the only anti-trans bill that passed, or the only two anti-trans bills that passed in 2020 are the Idaho sports ban, and then Idaho's ban on updating birth certificates. We get out of 2020 without the wave of anti-trans bills passing that we were afraid of. But unfortunately, what ends up happening is then you have momentum building leading up to the 2021 state legislative sessions. And lots of intervening things end up making it worse. So, you have lawmakers who are upset that they didn't get to move their bills. And so there's, the personal commitment to moving them by the time 2021 happens, and legislatures adjourn again in 2021. You also have, in June of 2020, the Supreme Court holding in the Bostock decision that federal prohibitions on sex discrimination encompass LGBTQ people. And so this is a huge win for us. And like all Supreme Court wins, as I mentioned with Obergefell, it leads to significant backlash. So not only do you have the continued commitment to attacking trans kids, you now have an intervening good Supreme Court case for us that is feeding backlash. And you have in November of 2020, the election of Joe Biden. So you have a shift in power at the federal level, which then of course leads to increased desire at the state level in supermajority conservative states in their legislatures to push back on the change in power of the federal government. Not to mention that in the 2020 elections, though Democrats ended up succeeding in taking both the House and Senate and Congress, as well as the presidency, there was a decreased emphasis on down ballot races. So things got much, much worse for the prospect of protecting trans people at the state level. So you have state houses that shift more to the right. You have some governors that flip. And so we're in a much more precarious place by the start of 2021, and now are dealing with what becomes the single most deadly legislative session for trans people in my history of doing this work. And I focus a lot of my time on state legislative advocacy, and I'm sure many of you are following. And what ended up happening is we had hundreds of bills introduced across the country that largely focused on banning trans girls and trans kids from sports and creating bans on healthcare for trans minors. Some of those bans implemented civil penalties, like in Arkansas, for example, the only state to actually pass one of those laws imposes a civil penalty and licensure penalties. Many of the other bills that ultimately did not pass in 2021 also carried criminal penalties. And so we are dealing with not just an aggressive introduction of bills targeting trans people, but the commitment to move these bills. So whereas we were largely successful in pushing back, in 2021, you have 8 states banning trans kids from sports. And then you have Arkansas implementing a categorical ban on the provision of gender affirming healthcare for trans minors, as well as referrals for that care. This is exceedingly troubling, and it is happening obviously in a global context in which there is a huge effort to take away healthcare from trans minors. We've seen it in the UK. It's something that is happening around Europe, and that is influencing what is happening in the US. Although largely, when we think about how is this movement being funded, the money is coming from very far right groups in the United States that have a long history of not just attacking trans people, but attacking reproductive rights for everyone, and in particular focusing on attacks on LGBTQ equality more broadly. So that is where we find ourselves in 2021. It is now October, or it is now November, and we are, very close to the start of the 2022 legislative sessions. And what I will say is that it is very, very likely that we are going to see a very aggressive effort to ban healthcare for trans minors beginning in 2022. The bills that we were able to defeat in 2021, we just got out of there by the skin of our teeth. They were able to pass the sports bans, and the states that passed the sports bans, they are going to be focusing very aggressively on the healthcare bans, and it's really scary. And I think that if we look at the conditions that are fueling this, it is, of course, in part the structure of state government, the structure of our political system, but it is as much a function of that as it is part of this very well coordinated public discourse that uses the far right media. So Fox News, for example, and right-wing blogs cover trans people, obsessively. You have stories running on Fox News about the threat of trans kids over and over. We have no counterpoint telling positive stories of trans people in our existence. And the impact of that is that it creates the sense that this is a serious problem, that trans people are a, quote, serious threat, that healthcare for trans people is a serious threat. And then those coded messages are deployed by the government, and then they are successfully implemented and passed into law. And we are at a moment, if we are not successful in pushing back on this, we will be in a situation within the next 2 years of 10 states banning care for trans minors. And we know, I know as a trans person and as an advocate for trans people, I'm sure many of you know as clinicians and providers for trans people, that if we take away these healthcare options, kids are going to die. And we see it, and I know it personally in my own life, watching people who have not had access to the care they need, and that has just resulted in so many catastrophic outcomes. Whether that's the sort of the decline in people's individual physical and mental health, or the ways in which that feeling is so demoralizing that people are not able to access things like stable housing and employment because they are not able to maintain their full sense of self. And it is very difficult, obviously, to access these already discriminatory institutions if you are not at your core being well treated. So that is a really serious concern for us moving into this next year. And not only are we fighting back against this aggressive machine in state legislatures that is going to be prioritizing and pushing these bills. And they were in 2021. It took every ounce of every second of so many people's time to stop these, including many, many incredible doctors and other clinicians who showed up, who testified. We absolutely need that. We need people showing up. We need people writing op-eds. We need every single medical association and entity to make clear the harm that these will cause. We absolutely need to keep doing that. But even if we do, we're still facing an uphill battle. And not only that, we are then contending with a federal judiciary that has been completely transformed under the Trump administration, where it is more difficult to bring challenges to these laws into court. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to do it. We are absolutely going to do it. But we are facing a very, very scary uphill battle. And so where does that leave us in the courts and sort of what's happening? We have a number of cases at the ACLU where we immediately challenged some of these laws. I will run through a few and sort of explain where they are and where they're headed and what that could mean. So in the context of the bans on sports participation, we have 3 cases. One was a challenge to Idaho's law that was filed immediately after it was passed in 2020. We were successful in the lower court, in the federal district court, and the judge in an incredibly well-reasoned and thorough opinion, relying extensively on expert testimony from doctors, both pediatricians in state explaining how sports physicals work, as well as sort of experts in the field of transgender health, endocrinologists and child psychiatrists, finding that the law was likely unconstitutional and blocking it from going into effect. That injunction, that block on Idaho's law is still in effect, and the case is being litigated on appeal, as well as some sort of complex procedural issues in the district court. For now, Idaho's law is still blocked, and we will continue to defend the good ruling that we had at the district court in Idaho. In a similar case that was filed in 2021, we also blocked a West Virginia law that was a categorical ban on trans participation in sports consistent with their gender identity for girls and young women. We filed that case on behalf of a single trans young person who had been on blockers and argued that, at least as applied to her, the law was unconstitutional and violated Title IX. There's also an injunction in effect as to that law. The state did not appeal that preliminary ruling, so that case will move forward to trial in the lower court in West Virginia. And then on the flip side, we are defending 2 young trans people in Connecticut. And Connecticut, unlike these states that pass categorical bans, Connecticut has a good policy that allows for participation based on gender identity. A lot of controversy has grown out of Connecticut's policy, in part because even though the policy had been in effect for 10 years, there were 2 young women who were incredibly hard workers who were successful in track, who had some success. And notably, they were young Black trans women. There's a huge amount of racism that is going on in this conversation. And they became the subject of a years-long targeted campaign on Fox News in the public conversation. Ultimately, some cisgender young women represented by Alliance Defending Freedom ended up suing Connecticut to block their policy that allowed trans inclusion in sports. And this is something that we're seeing a lot, is where a state or a school district has an inclusive policy, ADF and other far-right groups are finding cisgender people, particularly cisgender young women, to sue to try to stop that from going into effect. And the arguments that they're raising are both constitutional and statutory, essentially arguing that it is illegal to protect trans people. Now, the danger of this is that they're not saying it's, it's not like our cases, which say it's illegal to discriminate. If we win those cases, then we strike down individual discriminatory laws. They're arguing that it's illegal to protect trans people. If they are ultimately successful, let's say at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finds there's some sort of privacy right or other constitutional right that cis people have not to participate in activities or share space with trans people, that means that no state could pass a protective policy, an inclusive policy. That is their end game, and it is a scary one, and it is something that we're seeing in a lot of different contexts, and that's sort of what we're contending with in that Connecticut case. We were successful in getting their case dismissed. It is now on appeal. So we have a number of cases on appeal in this context, and we're continuing to push back against the efforts to pass more bills of this kind. And then looking at the map of where can we continue to fight back in court? How do we prepare for the possibility of the Supreme Court taking a case like this when we know that there's just a lot more education to do? Even people who should be with us in trans inclusive are not with us on sports because they have this idea and misunderstanding really about who trans people are. What are we talking about when we're talking about trans kids in schools? And why should we be acting on the side of inclusion? And I think in this space, there are a lot of hard conversations to have, and it's been really helpful to have providers talk through the impact of, for example, pubertal suppression on the body, the impact of hormone therapy, to educate the decision makers, whether those are legislative bodies or judges, about, particularly for trans young people who have access to medical care, who are transitioning at a young age, what does that mean in terms of what is happening in their body hormonally and how are they developing? But there's, I believe, a larger and more important conversation to be had about, when we're talking about kids, we're talking about athletics in the school context. Why are we not prioritizing inclusion, participation, and support for people? And when you have young people who know who they are, we should absolutely not be undermining that by telling them they have to participate in sports based on their assigned sex at birth. And this is a really hard conversation that is playing out. And I think we need to be better. We need to be more bold. We need to be more creative. And we need to think, more about how we talk about our sexed bodies and how we talk about our care and how we talk about the importance of affirming trans young people, even trans young people who, for a number of reasons, may not have access to things like pubertal suppression or hormone therapy, whether it's because their parents don't support them or because they simply don't have access to healthcare and can't afford it. So that's, going on in the courts, it's going on in the legislatures. We're already at a situation where a significant part of the country is banning trans kids from sports. And I think it's going to get worse. And I think we have an obligation to keep fighting for these young people and telling different stories. And then, of course, alongside of this is, the very concerning bans on care. And these are so troubling for so many reasons. Arkansas did pass their law. It was, we had an incredible campaign. The governor vetoed the law. His veto was overridden within 24 hours. We are talking about incredibly conservative, supermajority Republican legislatures where it is very, very difficult once a bill starts moving to stop it. And Arkansas passed their ban. It was based on a huge amount of misinformation. They're leveraging the decision from the UK around the Tavistock clinic and this idea that care for trans minors is unknown and fundamentally harmful. And I know that there's a question of the scientific debate around sort of how do we best provide care to trans young people. This is not a genuine debate that lawmakers are having or that courts are having. They do not care about the best provision of care. Their arguments, to be clear, are that it is inherently harmful to be trans, and that is the responsibility of the state to stop people from being trans. They are not interested in some sort of meaningful debate about how to best to provide the care, how to ensure proper outcomes, how to ensure informed consent for young people who are making these decisions with their families. What they are interested in, and if you read their quote unquote expert reports, they say things like, trans people are miserable in adulthood. They will not form romantic attachments. They are inherently narcissistic. And that that we should be concerned about having more trans people, and the state should step in to stop people from being trans. That is the conversation that people are having. That is the conversation that pseudo public intellectuals like Helen Joyce or Abigail Shrier, they do not want a genuine conversation. They want a conversation that pushes a point of view that says transness is bad, that being trans is wrong. They will say that that's not what they're doing, but if you read their materials, that is the core of what they're saying. And that discourse is being used in court and in legislatures to take away survival opportunities for transgender people of all ages. And I cannot emphasize this enough. The end game here is not banning care for trans minors. That is an entry point. The end game is banning care for all trans people and setting up systems within the government, both at the legislative and the judicial level, and ultimately, depending on what happens in our future presidential elections at the executive level as well, that empowers the government to constrain our opportunities for survival. And they will do that by not only punishing trans people for being trans, but punishing our families. For example, in Texas, there's a proposal, there are many bills that have tried to classify gender affirmation as a form of child abuse, punishing our families, punishing our doctors, these proposals to make it a felony in Alabama, for example, to provide care to trans young people consistent with the endocrine guidelines, consistent with the WPATH standards. And so that is what is happening. That is the direction that we are going in. We were successful in blocking Arkansas's law. And we are now going to be fighting on appeal to defend our win, and also moving forward to trial in the Arkansas Federal District Court. That case is going to have a huge impact on what we're going to be able to do in order to continue to protect trans young people and trans healthcare in general, and the ability to continue to do research, the ability to continue to support trans youth, trans adolescents, trans adults in the provision of this care, because this is not about the best way to treat trans people. This is about whether the state can stop treating trans people. And I think that's a really important distinction, because I am worried, and I have seen that there are efforts to engage in scientific and medical discourse in the public realm of whether that's journalism or op-eds or Twitter, other forms of this type of more public engagement about concerns over the provision of care and how to do it best. But that's not what we're having. That's not the conversation we're having in court. That's not the conversation we're having in legislatures. I mean, we are talking about people who think it is, the will of God to not let people be trans. For ideological, so-called health care providers who believe that it is harmful to be trans and it is the role of clinicians to stop people from being trans through one form of conversion therapy or another. And every time we engage on their terms and try to have a conversation about how to better provide this care, it is weaponized against us. And they will go through every single thing that we have said in order to bring to court the idea that this care is so controversial and so outside the norm, such that it should be banned. And that's what we're contending with in court and in legislatures. And I am someone who spends a good majority of my time reading what the other side is presenting in court, what they're presenting in legislative testimonies, what they're writing in the public discourse. I have been personally threatened and attacked quite consistently even if I'm saying nothing, so for example, when I was preparing to argue a case at the Ninth Circuit to defend our win in the Idaho case involving the ban on trans women and girls participating in women and girls sports. I received, so many messages on social media, as well as in my personal accounts, talking about how I am a biological woman who is delusional and thinks I am a man and trying to take away rights for women, attacking me personally, making fun of my appearance, making fun of transness. And I'm a 38-year-old professional whose job it is to do this, but this is also happening to my clients. This is also happening to trans young people. This is also happening to parents who are trying to do right by their kids. And if we don't partner together, if we are not coordinated in our effort to push back on the incredibly strategic deployment of misinformation about trans people, our lives, our care, and our joy, then we are going to lose this fight. And we are going to lose this fight in a way that is going to cost lives. We are going to lose our young people because they are up against a set of challenges that we were not. And they have more access to visibility, more access to healthcare, and more access to information than we had, whether we're of my generation or older generations, but they also have a systematic assault in a judicial and legislative set of systems that is primed to hurt them. And I am very concerned about where we're headed. And so here's what I think we need to do. I think this is an all hands on deck moment. I think we need people testifying in every state legislative hearing in 2022 to make clear that this is care that is effective, that it is safe, that it is important, that it is provided pursuant to protocols, and that banning it, which is fundamentally unlike how medical care is treated in every single other context, it is inappropriate and deeply harmful, not only to our trans community, not only to your patients, not only to my clients, but to the practice of medicine and the ability of maintaining the health and welfare of an entire generation of young people. And so we have a absolutely enormous fight ahead of us. I will say in no uncertain terms that decisions to engage with people like Abigail Shrier, people like Helen Joyce, people who have a singular focus to think about and talk about trans people as inherently damaged and as needing to not be trans, those engagements are going to cost people lives. And here's why. Those people, whether it's J.K. Rowling or Abigail Shrier or Stephen Levine, they have various forms of a platform that are being fed through a global, well-funded machine that has a very well-coordinated strategy to attack us and to create legal norms that make it impossible for us to survive. It is their project. I see it every day in the papers that they file in court, in the things that they say in state legislative hearings. They are smart, unfortunately, they are strategic. And if we're not careful, they will be successful. And we will not stop fighting. But our missteps are going to hurt our community. Our lack of thoughtfulness and engagement is going to hurt our community. And it is not going to improve our advocacy potential. It's not going to improve survival opportunities. And it is certainly not going to improve the provision of healthcare because their long-term goal is to get rid of it altogether. And so as we move into this next period where we are fighting back on every front, and it is going to be a brutal year in 2022. I look forward to continued partnerships between legal advocates and medical and mental health providers. This is work that is going to decide whether we are on a trajectory that looks more like the trajectory towards marriage equality, where we were able to be successful because we had a well-coordinated strategy, or is it going to look like the entrenched backlash that we see to abortion that is ultimately going to result in a constitutional decision that may take away the right altogether? And this is our inflection point. And so I am committed to this work every day of my life. I am committed to being in partnership with you. I'm committed to having hard conversations. And I hope that as we build out our strategy to push back on what we're seeing, that we can really think about how to build out survival opportunities for trans communities, how we can ensure that trans young people are not losing the care that they need. You know, they already don't have access to the care. You know, we know that. Thankfully, the terrible decision out of the UK that resulted in a lot of care being shut down there has been overturned. And we will continue to use every tool in the toolbox to fight back and build out systems for trans justice. And I hope that we can stay in partnership, and I look forward to further engagement and any questions that you have. So thank you for everything you've done to advocate for trans young people in our current legislative advocacy and litigation. Thank you to our experts. Thank you for all the amicus briefs. They make a huge difference, and I look forward to continuing partnerships. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chase, for that wonderful presentation. That was fantastic. And thank you to all of our audience members for the robust questions and your participation in this event. So one of the questions that we're getting over and over again is, you know, what is the role of medical providers in legal and legislative advocacy? If you have any advice for our membership on ways to get involved, policy points, things that we can do to help promote the care for transgender youth and help fight these attacks on transgender rights. Any advice you have, I think our membership would really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, though, and thanks everyone for joining. I can't think of a more critical time for clinicians and medical professionals to be engaged, because this is a fight over expertise, over the reality of what this care is. So, you know, we need providers to weigh in legislative sessions, particularly providers in the states where these bills are being pushed. And, you know, I don't know exactly where that will be in 2022, but I think we can expect that we're going to see a lot of these bills banning care for trans minors, probably in over half the states, which means—
Is there anything you want me to add to the grocery list? I have groceries being
please.
And so, you know, paying attention to the legislation, I will make sure to try to make that available to people, and, you know, through social media, through the ACLU and elsewhere. We also need the medical associations and other associations to weigh in. The AAP has been hugely helpful in weighing in, but we need every medical organization, association in the United States to try to have statements out that are specific to particular pieces of legislation. And making sure that we're countering the narrative that's coming out of these state legislatures. And then we need experts. You know, we've used a number of experts. I think each piece of litigation requires, we have pediatric ethicists, we have endocrinologists, we have pediatric psychiatrists, but we need to build we need more and more experts. We need people to weigh in. And, you know, I can't say enough how dangerous it is to be having, sort of attacking trans healthcare from within the community. We may all have questions about how to better deliver this care, how to better serve our community, but we are dealing with the very well-funded, weaponized attack on trans lives and trans bodies, and every single thing that comes up is being, you know, funneled through a far-right system of legislative government and the judicial, context. And so the reality is that everything that is taken out of context is going to come up in court, is going to come up as a way to attack trans people. And I think this is a really delicate time where we need to make sure that people understand that this care is life-saving, this care, it's important, and that it is supported by, you know, professionals and supported by, by WPATH, by USPATH, by the APA, by the AAP, by the AMA, by the Endocrine Society, by the Pediatric Endocrine Society. If you're in leadership in any of those places, we need consistent and ongoing statements and support in the legislative context, and we need experts in litigation and amicus briefs as well. And so many people have been doing that, and so I think it's just about broadening that engagement.
Thank you so much, Chase. We have other questions about how a federal non-discrimination statute would affect the anti-trans bills that are being brought at the state level. Are you able to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the Equality Act is a piece of federal legislation that would essentially codify what the Supreme Court held in Bostock, which is that, sex discrimination, prohibitions on sex discrimination that currently exist include LGBTQ people, but it would go farther than that by adding explicit protections and expanding protections. Right now, there are no federal prohibitions on sex discrimination in public accommodations and in federal funding. So there is legislation that would greatly broaden the scope of how protections exist at the federal level. That said, bills that are being pushed in the states are already illegal under federal law. These bills violate the Constitution. The sports bills violate Title IX. But none of our laws are self-executing to that degree. And so we would still have to go to court. So even if we had federal legislation that, like the Equality Act, which passed the House and is going nowhere as of right now in the Senate, because of what the Senate is like, yes, we need those expanded protections. But unfortunately, when you go lobby in a state legislature that is determined to do discriminatory things, they don't care what the Constitution says. They don't care what federal statutes say, because they're eager to push their agenda. They're ready to fight in court, unfortunately, and we have to do that. We have to meet them there. We have to sue them. And obviously, we want more tools in our toolbox. We want more federal protections that we can use to argue against these types of bills. But those protections won't be self-executing. We're still going to face these types of attacks. And I think we have a lot of great legal arguments now. But the problem is that we have state legislatures that are shifting further and further to the right. We have voter suppression tactics that are going to make this problem even worse in the coming years. And then, of course, we have a federal judiciary that under the Trump administration shifted so far to the right that even though, thankfully, we've been successful in the lower courts, we were able to block Arkansas's law. We've been able to block numerous anti-trans sports laws. Once these go up on appeal, I think it's going to be a really different situation. We're going up into more and more conservative courts. The attack on healthcare in a multitude of contexts is increasing. I think we're going to see more and more erosion, not only of sort of broad-based civil rights protections, but of the delivery of care and the ability to provide care to people in the abortion context, of course, but then also increasingly in this trans health context. So I think we have a lot to be worried about in the future. And yes, we can use legislative advocacy to try to stop that and see if we can get Congress to actually do something. But that's only one very, very small part of what we need to do. And I think we need to be creative, especially for providers. Like, how are we going to get people care in these states? And we may be in a situation, much like we are increasingly in the abortion context, where we have protesters outside of clinics, we have care being prohibited, in some cases criminalized. And so I think we're going to have to come up with ways to support our communities, even if that is taking people out of state and trying to help them get the care that they need.
Thank you so much. We have a question about care in prisons and how the sort of delays in delays is accurate, but how the quality of care in prisons for transgender people affects and is related to this larger question of access to care broadly for transgender people.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at the prison system in the United States, we have a serious problem with medical care in general. And obviously, the more stigmatized the care is, the more difficult it is to access in a carceral context. And, although I will say in some ways it's been through, pro se prison litigation. So prisoners suing their prisons without attorneys over the last several decades that really created the legal precedents around the medical necessity of care for gender dysphoria that then was imported into non-prison contexts. So some of the earliest and best cases around why healthcare for trans people is medically necessary comes from prisons, prison litigation, because the 8th Amendment, which is the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment in the Constitution, lays out it's a very high burden, but it is a framework that prisoners have used. And we, over the last 15 years, you can see an increase in access to care, at least at the policy level, for people who are incarcerated, and particularly when it comes to hormones. That said, obviously the implementation of those things are much more difficult. And even if a prison has the prison system or a jail system has stopped prohibiting the care, it's really hard to get people access to ongoing and consistent care that they need. It's really been difficult to get people access to surgery while they're incarcerated. And so these fights are very much ongoing. There is a lot of litigation on behalf of individuals and against whole systems to try to increase access to care. I think the more that this notion that trans people are ourselves inherently dangerous in one way or another, or that our care is, inherently quote unquote experimental, the more that those types of ideas are codified into law through these anti-trans bills, the more difficult it will be for people to access care in a host of contexts. And even though we've been able to see an expansion of insurance coverage, both in the private insurance and public insurance context over the last, 10 years, I mean, when I had, surgery like 12 years ago, the idea that it would be covered by insurance was like preposterous in many ways, and now that's obviously really changing. I think, though, these are very precarious developments, and that the more we sort of watch these bills become law, the more we codify notions of transness as deviance and of transness as something to be cured or stopped, the more we're going to see the erosion of care generally, not just for young people, but for all of us. And I think that this could not be a more pivotal time. And I would say 2022 is probably going to be the year that determines the trajectory of the next 10 to 15 years. Because if we end up in a situation where 5 to 10 bills criminalizing care for trans minors pass, it may be that we spend the next 40 years trying to undo that rather than moving the ball forward. And so if there was ever a time to be really engaged and really thoughtful and try to expand access to care, that the time is now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chase. We have two related questions. One sort of about leveraging the mainstream medical establishment to educate people regardless of politics. And then the other is about the sort of fringe professional associations like the American College of Pediatricians that are very right-wing focused, commenting on transgender care and not having any experience in the field. So if you can, those are related. We have 3 minutes left. I'm not sure if you're able to tie them together and talk about how we can shift the medical community. But please, your comments are appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, I think the public discourse is so important right now. And so whether it's, and for mainstream medical associations or for providers in general to weigh in and talking about sort of not only the legitimacy and importance of this care, but the risk to medicine writ large if we are to allow the state to come in and intrude upon the profession in this way, I think is incredibly important. And there are a lot of fringe professionals or, people who have no real experience with trans care weighing in, but there are also people who are leveraging their past association with WPATH in order to sort of legitimize their voice in court. Stephen Levine being the most obvious example of that. But I think increasingly we're seeing voices in the medical context and elsewhere. And, we have former ACLU lawyers, for example, who are huge anti-trans advocates. It's their entire identity, leveraging their past association with the ACLU. And so while there are a lot of fringe voices out there and the so-called, American College of Pediatricians, which is just a right-wing Christian organization, but sounds more legitimate, I think we need to sort of make clear that those voices are outlier views when it comes to the practice of medicine. But that said, there is sort of widespread public discursive support for the idea that, supporting trans people, especially trans minors, is unknown, it is experimental. We don't have sort of randomized controlled long-term longitudinal studies supporting the care, and people throw out that type of discourse, especially on the right. But there's this reflexive support for it, even in sort of more liberal and progressive spaces. And so I think we all have a lot of work to do to sort of demystify what we're actually talking about and really centering the voices of trans people. A lot of what we're hearing from our opponents in court and legislatures is that, trans people are inherently miserable, joyless people who are not loved, who are not supported, who will not find support later in life. And so we should intervene when they're young to try to sort of steer them away from this trans lifestyle. And it's coming not just from Dr. Cruz and Dr. Levine and these people who are the experts on the other side, but from J.K. Rowling and Abigail Shrier and a bunch of other people who claim that we're pushing young girls into transness and other things. And we have a responsibility to counter that narrative. And it isn't just coming from the far right. It isn't just coming from spaces that are seen as ideologically opposed to transness. It's expanding greatly. And so I think those of us who have an understanding of the harm of what's being said and done need to really engage with a lot of force. And as I said, the time is now. Right? We simply can't wait. The things we're reading and seeing, are getting worse and worse. The breadth of it is getting greater and greater. And so I think, we have to act now. This is a very scary time, and we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you so much, Chase. I don't know if we have time to entertain one more question, but I think this is a very insightful question about how we can push trans affirming care from the realm of experimental and off-label to, getting an FDA indication or, other more official designations for this work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously not an expert as much in this area. I will say that we find the arguments about like FDA off-label to be so incredibly unpersuasive because the majority of pediatric, medicine is provided off-label, and there's lots of reasons why that happens. And this care is being singularly attacked for this reason. That said, I think investing more support and having more funding to sort of research and support trans care and the delivery of effective trans care is hugely important. For all of us, and sort of countering the narrative from the other side, both with increased, studies and data and FDA support is important, but also highlighting the fact that so much of medicine, it develops over time and changes. And there are lots of things that people may come to regret in small percentages, but we don't ban it. There's lots of care that's provided FDA off-label. There's lots of care for which we don't have double-blind, randomized control trials, and sort of making sure people understand that these sort of half arguments that are being weaponized against trans people could be applied to much of medicine, but it's this particular type of care that's being targeted.
Right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time and your comments, and thank you, audience members, for your robust participation. We are over time, and I just want to thank everyone for a third time for their role in this morning's plenary.
Thank you, everyone.